The political panel All-Stars are up shortly, whānau. But first, this week's 1 on 1 in 10 with the Executive Director of Greenpeace, Dr. Russell Norman. Kia ora, comrade. Welcome to the show and thank you for being available to the Fourth Estate. Your democracy is grateful.
Good evening, Martin. How you going?
Very well, my friend. Russell, before we get to this insane decision by the government on methane, can we please just rewind to last week's damning 3-yearly update from the Ministry of the Environment and Stat New Zealand that warned New Zealand's oceans are warming 34% faster than the global average and that New Zealand, $180 billion worth of housing is at risk of flooding. What did you make of that report, and are we in denial about the ramifications?
Yeah, so that report was focused particularly on the interaction between the marine environment and climate change. And so they were looking at rising sea levels, increased storm events, impact on particularly coastal housing, but also inundation for inland areas, which are, it's going to get flooding. But it also was interesting for looking at the impact in terms of climate change on the fishing industry and the kind of negative consequences of that. The other interesting thing about it was that it did also talk about the impact of things like bottom trawling, which the New Zealand fishing industry is very keen on to destroy deep sea coral environments. We know that the orange roughy fishery, the largest orange roughy fishery, has just collapsed. Yeah. And they've had to cut the quota to that. And so it's all just one thing on top of another. In terms of the warming, yeah, New Zealand, the waters around New Zealand are warming faster than elsewhere. And that's kind of amplifying the effect on us of climate change.
I mentioned in the opening monologue that scientists are concerned about massive methane seeps in Antarctica. The fear is that we are crossing tipping points in the biosphere that could cause cascade shutdowns of essential environmental systems. Why are these concerns, which represent existential threats, being completely ignored?
Essentially because our kind of political process is dominated by existing power structures, right? So, I mean, you're seeing the fossil fuel industry is having a huge influence in terms of governance, particularly in the United States. Obviously, we're seeing it particularly there. But of course, in New Zealand, it's agribusiness is the fossil fuel of our economy. It's this kind of dominant resource sector, and they're having a huge impact on climate policy here. And so, we live in a democracy. We have certain democratic rights and freedoms, and people do get to vote once every 3 years. But in between those votes, these very powerful vested interests have a huge impact in basically undermining democratic rights because they just have it's just the nature of political economy and a capitalist system that those very dominant industries have a huge impact on government decision-making. And it's very hard for ordinary people to influence government decision-making on a day-to-day basis, day-to-day way, in the same way that when you have big corporate lobby groups who are knocking on doors every day of every week. It's just this huge power imbalance around government decision making.
Let's turn to the government's decision on methane, which effectively allows corporate dairy farmers just completely off the hook. Greenpeace has described this as Luxon goes full Trump with climate denying methane backdown. What are your concerns?
Well, methane's about half of New Zealand's emissions, 48% or thereabouts. And so basically, if you're saying you're only going to cut emissions by 14% by 2050, basically you're saying you're not going to do anything about climate change in terms of cutting emissions. So, I mean, it's basically, it's Trumpian in the sense that it's effectively climate denialism, because you're basically saying the biggest pollutant produced by New Zealand, which is methane, we're not going to do anything about. The thing about methane is that it's extremely powerful warming, much in the short term, much more powerful than carbon dioxide. But the great thing about it is that if you cut your methane emissions now, then you do start to get, down the track 12 years or so, you get significant drops in methane levels. And so it gives you the opportunity to actually pull out of the climate change death spiral in a faster way than carbon dioxide cuts do. So a lot a lot of the scientists globally are saying, hey, look, methane actually is actually really could be one of the solutions, because if we can cut methane levels, then we can get pretty rapid reductions in warming. So Luxon's doing the exact opposite of that.
The Climate Change Commission recommended methane cuts of 35 to 47%. However, documents released under the Official Information Act revealed pressure from lobby groups like Federated Farmers, whose ex-president Andrew Hoggart is now an ACT Party MP, for the government to establish a separate panel to review the methane target, and that panel has, surprise, surprise, landed on a much weaker methane target. Is this government strangling the common good for their donors' interests?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just donors. I think you've also got to understand it in a system-wide issue, right? So we have this big, powerful dairy sector, which is, just has enormous influence on government decision-making on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing it in freshwater regulation as well. So basically there's cut after cut after cut in terms of regulations to protect fresh water.
Yep.
And it was the freshwater regulations that were producing significant reductions in agricultural emissions, because the dairy herd had peaked and was starting to come down. Right. And that was largely driven by the rules around fresh water. Yeah. And so since they've weakened all the rules around fresh water, obviously Hoggard's the associate agriculture minister, the former president of Federated Farmers. Now they've weakened all the rules around fresh water. We're seeing the dairy herd growing again. So you've probably got another 35 dairy cattle have been consented just in Canterbury alone. Yes. And it's that growth in the dairy herd particularly which is going to drive emissions forward. There's some things you can do within, if you maintain the dairy herd at the same level, you can get significant emissions reductions, which is what the Climate Change Commission was calling for. It was saying you can reduce emissions by up to 47%, even with existing herds. But it's also true that we've just got too many dairy cattle. So, Southland used to have 40,000 dairy cattle. It's now got 640,000 dairy cattle. In 30 years, we added 1.1 million dairy cattle into Canterbury. So we've just overdone the dairy cattle thing, and it's having a dramatic impact in terms of fresh water as well as climate change. And that's why Ngāi took its court action in the South Island to try to get some control over the regulation of rivers in the South Island, because central government has just let the dairy herd completely destroy them. And that's just the dominance of agribusiness within this particular government.
It seems whatever the problem is, national solution is more cows. In an open letter shared with the Financial Times, 26 climate scientists from around the world warned that New Zealand's proposed new methane targets risk setting a dangerous precedent. This government revived in June the 100% pure tourism brand in light of the methane decision. Isn't that tourism advert nothing but greenwash bullshit?
Yeah, it's plainly greenwash. I mean, the thing is what they're trying to do is redefine the science around methane warming. So they've used this no additional warming metric. And which is not supported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's not supported by the New Zealand Parliamentary Commission for the Environment. It's not supported by the Climate Commission in New Zealand. And of course, on the front page of the Financial Times, it wasn't supported by the world's leading climate scientists either. And what they're saying is that if New Zealand gets away with this and changes the way that methane warming is considered, then it's going to have a dramatic impact in terms of enabling warming, because methane is such a potent warming gas. And so the global livestock industry is leading this campaign. New Zealand's part of it. The New Zealand government's part of it, but also Federated Farmers and Dairy NZ and Fonterra. And they're trying to unravel the science around methane warming. And so there's a big pushback as scientists all around the world are saying, we can't, if we let them get away with this huge increase in methane, then the impact in terms of climate change is dramatic. Whereas if we cut methane, we can also have pretty significant short-term effects. I mean, just today, there was the article in Nature about corals, suggesting that corals are at a tipping point because of bleaching events. Just repeated bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef, for instance, is just making it very difficult for those reefs to survive, even when in between bleaching events, because they're now so frequent because of global heating.
Dr. Bryce Edwards highlights that the recent local council elections had lobby groups like the Local Government Business Forum, a coalition including Business New Zealand, the New Zealand Initiative and Federated Farmers, openly calling for voters to elect candidates with commercial and financial acumen and a pro-growth and pro-development mindset. Is part of the problem here in New Zealand that business lobby groups can mask their polluter interests with dark ag money that the wider electorate can't see?
I mean, so particularly in the dairy areas, you certainly are seeing the big impact of those vested interests. And obviously we saw that in the Canterbury Regional Council election. You see it in Southland and elsewhere, where you've got these big dairy huge dairy herds and big dairy interests. But I mean, you could look at it a different way. It's like New Zealand's got this resource curse, like some countries get oil and it becomes a resource curse. So we've got this dairy resource curse. And it's now just so dominant that it's kind of influencing public policy. Because the thing about the climate change decision that was made yesterday around methane is that if agriculture is let off the hook, so they don't have to cut their methane emissions, but we're still trying to meet our Paris climate agreements, then it means the whole rest of the economy has to cover the emissions, or we have to pay for overseas carbon credits, which obviously is silly and largely nonsense. But one way or another, the whole rest of the economy, everyone else living in New Zealand has to cover this if the dairy sector is given a free pass. On top of that, the dairy sector is highly subsidised through all this research around trying to find magic ways to reduce methane emission. The government says they've spent $400 million of taxpayer money subsidising this process. So you get an industry like dairy, which is like the oil industry in Saudi Arabia or something like that, which kind of sits there and dominates public policy, even though it's to the detriment of the broader economy and obviously to the detriment of climate and fresh water. But from a New Zealand perspective as a whole, it means that the special interests of the dairy agribusiness are dominating over the broader public interest, but also the broader economy and the interests of the broader economy.
Finally, Russell, many will feel very angry that once again the bloody corporate farming lobby have avoided paying for their pollution. What should people do if they want meaningful change?
Well, I mean, I think it really is important that people keep turning up to protest and keep expressing their opposition. I mean, we're 2 years into this government, which is engaged in this war on nature, and it's not just climate, it's fresh water, it's the oceans, the fishing industry, energy as well, obviously is a huge problem because they've been subsidising new oil and gas exploration. So, I mean, people are going to have to keep fighting and standing up for what's important if they want themselves and their kids to have a livable planet. Because what we do here, we're a small part of a global picture, right? But if New Zealand unravels, or like we're under the current government trying to unravel global climate agreements, it means the thing comes apart. And we need the big emitters like like China in particular, to be part of global agreements. And our role in that is to make sure the global agreements stick. And currently the New Zealand government's trying to unravel them to achieve the short-term interests of agribusiness. And so we have to keep speaking out about that really, really loudly, and demand at the next election that politicians of from all parties stand up for action on climate and to protect the environment. Because, for us and our kids, it's having a living planet's a great thing, and we don't want to see it destroyed.
Thank you, comrade. We look forward to speaking with you again soon. Kia ora.